Well, this is the first time I've ever addressed Reedies where I wasn't a Reed student, which was now, gosh, 30 years ago. So I'm really honored. Reed was very formative for me. I also feel a little bit trepidatious because I feel like I'm in a room of real physicists, and what I'll be sharing is definitely kind of on the tail of the bell curve in terms of the direction that my career took. Let's see. So I work mostly as an independent consultant developing regulatory frameworks to scale the deployment of village renewable energy mini-grids for electricity access. Here's a picture of one of these projects. It's in Myanmar. This is kind of typical in size. This one has about 75 kilowatts of PV, a lithium-ion battery, and a diesel generator for backup power. And it serves several hundred people in a rural village with 230 volt AC electricity. And then on the right are some pictures of kind of like, the difference that this makes in a typical village. The main countries that I've been working with in the past decade or so have been Tanzania, Nigeria, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Haiti, Vanuatu, and Myanmar. And then I also co-author some World Bank books that try to make sense of the emerging village mini-grid space and how to support its development through assistance with program design and subsidies and regulatory support. And these are all free books available for free at those links. We're at a really fascinating inflection point on mini-grids. Solar PV and lithium-ion battery prices have plummeted, and the battery prices are likely to plummet further with the expanding electric vehicle industry. And at the same time, the efficiency of electrical loads has really increased through LED lighting and more efficient electronics overall. The ubiquity of cell phones has a couple of big implications for mini-grids. On the one hand, basically now everyone on the planet wants a little bit of quality electricity to charge their phone. And also 2G and 3G and 4G networks send data for real-time monitoring of mini-grids in the field and enable dispatching technicians to solve problems before they start cascading into bigger problems. And also around most of the world, there's these mobile payment platforms like Kenya's M-Pesa, shown here on an old Nokia phone, that allow for collecting tariffs in a way that's a lot less costly and a lot less risky than old-fashioned cash payments. And then finally, there's geospatial technologies that use satellite data for automated planning of mini-grid networks and estimation of load profiles. So from a satellite image, you go through and you say, oh, that looks like a house, that looks like a house, that looks like a house, that looks like it's something bigger than house, maybe a commercial establishment, and you make some estimations about, some assumptions about what the load profile is for each of those and aggregate them all. A couple of years ago, the World Bank was working with dozens of mini-grids, and now it's hundreds that have been installed, these solar hybrid mini-grids. This year, it's going to be thousands, and there's already tens of thousands in the pipeline. So it's expanding very rapidly. And now I'm going to shift to like my background and my trajectory, which is a little bit maybe self-indulgent, but it is also kind of quirky, and I'm hoping that kind of the quirky aspect of the Reed community will enjoy this. So I think I developed an early interest in solar electricity because I grew up as a young kid living without electricity on a little island. My mom was kind of part of the Back to the Land movement, and in the 70s we lived in a teepee for a while, and then in a cabin without electricity with kerosene lights. And when I was at Reed, my sophomore year, I started working summers at a renewable energy magazine called Home Power that was started by a small gang of electrical engineering oriented marijuana growers who lived in geodesic domes and plywood structures and in Northern California. And they used, at the time, these expensive newfangled photovoltaics for powering cassette tape players to listen to the Grateful Dead, and they also powered some Mac SE computers that were used to produce the magazine. And this magazine was like the central nervous system of an eclectic do-it-yourself solar community that was emerging, comprising of back to the landers and NASA scientists and survivalists and RVers and environmentalists and kind of general subversive anarchists. And a lot of the equipment at that time was not off the shelf. These days it is. And so, so a lot of practical kind of basic engineering was done and then shared with circuit diagrams and so forth in these pages, like this voltage regulator, shunt regulator that was using a 555 chip and a voltage regulator chip. And in conversations at the magazine, we'd say things like, in the future, you know, there's going to be millions of homes in America with solar panels on them, and they'll feed electricity into the grid. And people thought we were just nuts at that time. But that was a formative experience combined with my being at Reed. At Reed, I did a thesis on PN junction indium phosphide solar cells, theory, fabrication, and testing. I ended up going up to Oregon Graduate Institute in Beaverton to use some of their equipment, their chemical vapor deposition machines, and ended up making these dime-sized solar cells out of this expensive indium phosphide material, which didn't work particularly well, but it was really a great opportunity to dive into some of the semiconductor physics. A few years later, I went to grad school at University of California at Berkeley, their energy and resources group, which was a fantastic little program. It had about 50 graduate students, about half in the master's program and half doing PhDs. And a lot of them were retread physicists, so I felt kind of at home. I initially intended to do just a master's degree, the 2-year program, but kind of being at Berkeley was just a candy shop and it was really fun. So I ended up staying on for a PhD, which ended up taking 9 years. And part of why it was really time consuming was I got involved in distracting projects. This was one of the weirdest one, which brought me to North Korea 3 times to lead the electrical installation of a small 6-turbine village powered mini grid. And the whole project was part of a kind of a symbolic part of the opening of a broader US North Korea collaboration around energy that had stuff to do with the Cato project and the nuclear denuclearization that was happening under the Clinton administration. And then that opening really abruptly shut down pretty quickly when George H.W. Bush came in 1992 and referred to the North Koreans as the axis of evil. My wife, Chom, is also an ergi and was a collaborator on power sector work. And and she's from Thailand. And after she finished her master's degree at ERG, she went back to repay a government obligation and working in the country's Ministry of Energy. And I followed her and then kind of shifted my dissertation focus to look at community scale micro hydro power in rural Thailand. And it turned out that these things were getting abandoned. And one of the main reasons they were being abandoned was that the main national subsidized grid was coming in. And then as customers started kind of being pilfered away by the main grid, they would lose revenues and not be able to continue maintenance. And one of the issues was they couldn't connect to the national grid. So my PhD research ended up kind of parlaying into helping with my wife as kind of a co-collaborator, an opportunity for volunteer work to draft regulations that would allow customer-owned renewables to interconnect to Thailand's national grid. And this became the first of these types of regulations in Southeast Asia. And it really opened up an industry that really surprised everyone that was observing it. So I was just thinking, you know, some rooftop solar and micro hydro, but there were these surprising things like pig farms, that there was a great financial case for making electricity from anaerobic methane produced from manure, using converted taxi engines and old truck engines to drive induction generators. And another one was the cassava industry. Thailand grows a lot of tapioca, cassava, which is made into tapioca, and the process involves a lot of wastewater, and that again can make anaerobic methane, which at a single facilities could make several megawatts of electricity, as well as supply gas to drive the industrial processing. Here's another project, one of many rice husks fired power plants that came online under the regulations. And then there was lots of solar. And I'm not sure how many megawatts it is now, but I think it's well over 5,000 megawatts that have come online under that program. In 2007, I got an email from the World Bank saying, hey, how would you like to do similar regulations in Tanzania? And I said, sure, that sounds good. And so I started working as a consultant with the World Bank. And here's a photo of a group of Tanzanians that we brought to Thailand to learn from the Thai national utility on their implementation of the program. In Tanzania, as in a lot of Africa, rural electrification rates are really low, often in the teens or less. And there's about 680 million people in Africa without electricity. And so over time, the Tanzanian regulations, which had started out about grid connection of customer-owned renewables, had provisions for mini grids and kind of enabling the private sector development of mini grids. And so that led to other countries in Africa being interested in this. And so ever since, I've been working with other countries and deploying other regulatory frameworks. So sorry, I'm noticing this has taken more time than I thought it did, but this is my last slide. And I'll just end with a couple of reflections on the role of a READ education. A lot of the colleagues that I work with at the bank have excellent analytical skills, but often not a great deep understanding of technology that the grounding in physics can provide. So it's my sense that there's a lot of opportunities, especially for physicists interested in this space. Another thing is that the technology is often years ahead of the regulatory environment. And so once the regulatory environment gets kind of unlocked, then there can be a lot of things can start moving forward. And Reed's broad liberal arts training in how to approach problems and think critically and write has been a great start for developing an interdisciplinary toolkit, which I think is really useful in the regulatory space, where you need to balance technical and legal and economic and political domains. So with that, I'll stop. Sorry, I don't have too many minutes left for questions.
Chris, I guess I'll ask a quick question is, first of all, where's your home base right now? And then I guess my other kind of related question is, it looks like your career is kind of in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
This whole area is just, ripe for incredibly exponential growth.
It's exploding. It's been
both of those.
Yeah, it's been kind of the right time. I mean, I started out, it was as I mentioned, right, a bunch of hippies, and it's been a wave that's been kind of exponentially growing forever. It's just started from such a small base, but it's been, there's always much more work than I could ever possibly do in terms of what's on my own plate. I live on Lopez Island, where I grew up, and I live in a little net zero energy home, straw bale home, and mostly work from home. But then, pre-COVID would fly a few times a year for a few weeks to different countries to work.
Yeah, I have a friend that's on Friday in Friday Harbor, so we've been up there a few times. So
yeah,
I'm in Sammamish, Washington, which is kind of on the east side of Seattle here. So we're kind of in the same part of the world. But
yeah,
I think what's impressive too is how worldwide your activities are. That's and the impact you're having on, I guess, humanity in general is, I know, I'm just blown away by that.
Well, thank you. Wow, I'm humbled by that, and it's been a great ride and a lot of fun and great opportunity to work with a lot of great people in this field.
I have a question, Chris. I was curious if in comparing domestic versus international, especially in like developing countries, projects that you've worked on for microgrid and renewable energy development, like what are some of the similarities that regardless of where you are, these rural projects are the same, and what are the things that are really different?
That's a great question. I haven't done that much domestic work, and there's an interesting definitional issue around like, what do you mean when you say mini grid or microgrid? Because in the United States, microgrid tends to mean the same types of technologies like solar with batteries and maybe some backup, but it's in a very different context where electricity utility reliability is really high already. So you're going from like 99% reliable, unless you're in California, and then it's like 80% reliable, up to like 99.999% reliable to drive your data center or your hospital or something like that. And in the context that we work in, it's more like there wasn't electricity in the first place, or there was, you know, some guy had a diesel generator, but you're making electricity available now 24/7 at lower prices. And by the way, like lighting by kerosene is actually not only really dangerous, but it's also really costly. So these provide, you know, a lot more light for a whole lot less cost than burning kerosene. So the technologies are really similar, and we're benefiting from a lot of the technical innovation that happens in the OECD kind of level microgrids, but being deployed in the global South.
Thank you. Feel free, everyone, to raise your actual physical hand or your Zoom hand, or put a question in the chat bar if you have any for Chris. Was that you, Ted? Were you raising your hand? And then I saw Martin. No, Martin.
I just wanted to comment first that the story that you tell of bringing solar power to places that had no electricity previously is similar to what happened in some of these places where cellular telephony came in before there were
landlines,
telephone lines. But my question was, could you say something more about how you hooked up with the World Bank? Because from an island with no electricity to the World Bank is quite a jump.
Yeah, no, that was a kind of out of the blue. Ironically, my only interaction prior to the with the World Bank had been my wife and I had started a little NGO after the regulatory stuff in Thailand, and part of that was on kind of like public interest power sector analysis. And at one point, we got involved with a fight over a World Bank dam in Laos, the Nam Tung Tu dam, which was mostly exporting electricity to Thailand. And I got involved writing nasty letters to the bank's board of directors about how their economic analysis was really shoddy on that project. And so I was really surprised to get an email many years later from the bank saying, hey, we'd love we've heard about this regulatory framework in Thailand, and we'd be interested in doing similar things in Tanzania. And so I think that just speaks to a couple of things. One is that the World Bank is a huge organization. It's got 15,000 people, and often the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. And then it's a matter of kind of like putting your work out there. So in a lot of the work that we did, including PowerPoint presentations and so forth, publications, we would just post on the internet. So I think, you know, people kind of heard about it, and they were like, oh, this is kind of a niche little thing that we need to do in Tanzania. We've got a regulatory authority starting up. Tanzania wants to do this, and they cast around and found somebody who knew somebody who eventually kind of found me, and yeah, went from there. Well, thank you. I should turn it over to you, Martin.
Yeah, I think also we'll have time. Keep your other kind of open questions on any topic, because we will have time at the end to basically go as long as you want with certain limits or not. So yeah, let's go with Martin, and then I know we also want to have a few minutes for Professor Essick to just introduce himself and mention that he's here and part of the group and interested in finding out more about what we're up to. Okay, Martin, it's yours.
Thank you, Aris. I want to thank the organizers for changing the time so that I could participate. It's 8 p.m. where I am, 8:30, and 3 o'clock in the morning is not a good time for me for this kind of thing, although I'm frequently up at that hour. Okay, so when Amy asked for people who were doing things that were interesting or unexpected, I don't think that anything that I've done is terribly interesting, certainly not compared to what Chris has described, but it was completely unexpected to me. And in relation to the entire question of career counseling, I heard the expression career management for the first time when I was about 50, and it was too late for me. I have simply fallen into one thing or another going back to 1972 when I came to Reed, expecting to do the 3-2 program where I'd get a Reed BA and then an engineering degree from Columbia University. But I fell in love with physics. And so I decided to stay at Reed, and I created my own 3-2 program by staying at Reed for 5 years, spreading out my physics courses and taking as many courses as I could in the humanities and social science. After 5 years, I was pretty worn out. I decided to take a year off before going to graduate school. So I went home to New York to look for a job. And it was fairly depressing to go around looking for a job with a BA in physics. And so I went wherever I could where I thought there might be a job board. And one day I found myself at Columbia University, and I'm wandering around there, and a woman came out of her office and wanted to know who I was and what I was doing there. And we started chatting, and she picked up the phone and called Ken Davis, who had been my advisor at Reed and was at that time the physics chair still, who Ted will remember quite fondly, as I recall. And after 5 minutes on the phone with him, she said, "Okay, you're in. What do you want to study?" And so I chose electrical engineering, and here I was now doing a 5-2 program. And I have to say that after 5 years at Reed, Columbia felt like an extended vacation, sometimes a little bit like high school when people talked about grades and things that I didn't understand. And at the end, they did what they're good at, and they, of course, send everybody to recruiters. And they sent me to a recruiter from Bell Labs, who after 2 minutes said, "Okay, you're in. What would you like to do here?" So, you can't turn that down. This was at the very end of the heroic glory days of Bell Labs before the Bell system was split up, or actually split itself up, but I won't get into that. And I was in an interesting group. It was an applications group attached to the research side, where we were taking very new developments, very recent developments in fiber optics and optical technology, and trying to find customers outside of the normal telephone business, essentially big corporations that had a lot of money to spend and didn't need what we had, but wanted to show that they were on the cutting edge. So I worked at the Winter Olympics in 1980. I was ringside for the famous Soviet Union USA hockey game. I worked for Merrill Lynch in Wall Street. And from there, it was almost inevitable, as the Bell system was collapsing, that I migrated to the business side and ended up working at a very large international bank centered on Wall Street. But my office was on the 40th floor of a building right across from the Twin Towers. So I spent a time there essentially as a yuppie before the word had been invented, about 2 years before the word appeared in print. And it was all very interesting. I felt a bit like a spy operating behind enemy lines, but it was really boring. And the work was simply making sure that big banks were able to make their overnight deposits in other big banks. And I actually devoted more time to making sure that my appearance was appropriate, which may be difficult to imagine, but then it was, than I spent actually doing work. And I decided it was time to get back to physics. I was visiting my grandmother, who lived in Jerusalem, and again, just kind of naively wandered into the physics department at Hebrew University. And before I knew it, I was a graduate student again. Uh, and I did another master's in physics, working in supersymmetric quantum mechanics. And then looking for a doctoral program, I interviewed with a very well-known particle physicist at Weizmann Institute who said, I can't take you as a student, but I had to meet anyone insane enough to begin a PhD in elementary particles at the age of 34. So this was kind of depressing, but in the end, I found somebody to work with at Tel Aviv University in, it was called high energy physics, but it was really foundations of relativity theory. And while I was a student there, I happened to be at a demonstration against the occupation of Palestine. And I began an idle conversation with someone who just turned out to be a professor of computer science at Hebrew University. And a few minutes later, he offered me a job. And so a couple of weeks later, I was a research assistant in computer science at Hebrew University while I was doing my PhD at Tel Aviv University. So I was commuting. And that turned out to be a good move, because in 1995, I finally found myself out of school for the first time since, really for the first time since 1957, and no job, and with 2 kids. I found a job, oddly enough, through an ad in the newspaper that said, new academic department looking for faculty. Now, this is unheard of. Academic jobs are generally through search committees and connections and reputation and whatnot. It turned out that this was a department of telecommunications engineering. So I had the technical background. Of course, I had never studied most of the material in any formal way, but it was fine. They needed people to teach. And that lasted for a while. And then I moved to Hadassah College in Jerusalem, which was a better fit for me, primarily because there's a strong social agenda there. Most of the students are the first people in their families to have finished high school. There's a large number of Arab students and a majority of women students. So there is an element not only of teaching the technical material, but attempting to help people make the transition into what we call the middle class. But the best part was that they didn't expect anybody to do research in their teaching area. And that meant that for the first time in a while, I would be in a place where nobody really cared what kind of research I was doing. And a few people who had been working with my doctoral advisor in Tel Aviv and people who were working in related fields around the world founded an organization called the International Association for Relativistic Dynamics, IARD. And this has become my base for doing research. And I've more or less continued over the last 25 years with the work that I was doing for my doctorate in foundations of relativity. And so on the one hand, what I learned is if you want to have the career that you expect to have, then you have to devote more energy to having that career than to following what's really interesting to you. I was lucky that I started out on this path at the tail end of the 1960s when things were still more flexible and life was somewhat a little bit less brutal in terms of opportunities. I have no idea where I would have ended up if I I had followed a pre-planned career path, people say, don't you regret having left the high-paid world of Wall Street? And I remind them that my office was across the street from the Twin Towers, and if I had stayed in that job, I could have been evaporated along with the rest of them. So you never know where things are going to work out. I don't know whether there is anything that I can conclude from any of this that I would offer to anybody as career guidance, but that is my story.
Well, I think one career guidance is that sometimes our futures are not so terribly predictable, that we may think we're on a path, but then other opportunities come up. And I think that may be true for just about everybody that's on the call today, because certainly my direction is way different than what I would have predicted when I was at Reed, or even after I was in graduate school. My big change was that when I got my master's degree in physics, I thought, no, physics is getting too esoteric. And I switched over to double E, and I got a PhD in double E. And that basically saved my career, because I'm a very hands-on kind of person. And I as others, I kind of work out of my home here, but I have a lab downstairs. I got about 1,500 square feet of lab that's full of equipment. I have a couple of scanning electron microscopes and got all kinds of tektronix equipment. So my interests were much more practical than maybe the typical physics direction, at least in graduate school, where I went was the courses were very basic, like the thermodynamics of sodium chloride. I thought, gosh, I don't really want to know much about that. So it's interesting how our careers evolve, and maybe the guidance that we can give to newer students is watch for what you really want to do. I think your fundamental interests will kind of drive you where you finally end up.
Hi, Ted.
Thanks. Yeah, Martin's comment about the idea of career management I thought was fascinating. On one level, it would be really good to give people some guidance on look to your career if, like you said, like Martin said, if you want to go into something very specific, you need to guard to keep from getting into all the distractions that all the rest of us have had. On the other hand, perhaps keep an open mind to, you may think you're going into a particular career and that this is completely set in stone, but don't be too surprised if reality changes and presents you with a completely different set of forks in the road. I'm very amused at how all these different sort of migrations seem to fit with my own experience. And a few years ago when I was an alumni representative giving prospective student interviews, I got a brochure from the college that one of the lines in it was, "You are already what you want to be when you grow up." And that was intended to reassure students that don't worry about setting your path. Don't get too concerned that you don't want to know what you want to major in. But at the same time, I wonder if each of us, as we've meandered through different sub-careers, can see kind of a conserved characteristic that, we went from, in my case, physics to electrical engineering to oceanography to limnology, environmental science. What's the conserved trait in there? And I've always sort of decided it's converting phenomena into knowledge or something like that. But I think each of us could look at our careers and say, okay, what's the thing that's always been there, and what things evolved?
Thank you, Todd. I think it's important, not just for people who studied physics, but in any career, to have that kind of flexibility and not being too rigid about what they think their course is going to be. Hi, Chris.
Hi, yeah, this is Chris Rupp. I just had a question for the whole group. You know, the speakers at the first one that we had, I think both of them sort of prefaced their story about their career by kind of apologizing that they weren't doing straight physics and probably everybody else was. And then both speakers today said the exact same thing. I think probably very few of us actually are. So I don't do straight physics now. And I was wondering if, just like a show of hands, is anybody here doing like traditional physics research? All right, less than half, but some. But anyway, yeah, I suspect them. Yeah, well, it looks like the large majority of us aren't, and that's probably more typical, I think.
You know, from the lists of again, from all 800 some names, we have Amy's actually, we've created a chart. Maybe we'll present that at the next session that shows the career trajectories in sort of broad categories. And there is a good segment that has followed the, maybe it's called a traditional path into becoming faculty and finding which would generally require a PhD, and then they went on into teaching. One of my colleagues from my class, Neil Bertram, who was one of our really, I guess we all considered our top students, unlike me. But he was really interested in magnetics. And he ended up at UCSD, University of California, San Diego, as a professor. And he's, I've visited some folks down there. He's, very well respected and very well known in that area. So there's one example from my class where it was very much the traditional path that I guess we all had in mind, that we wanted to become like Professor Davis. So, and maybe this is a good transition to give Professor Essig just a little bit of an introduction, and any informal comments that they'd like to make on behalf of the current physics department. And then we are working to schedule a more complete opportunity for Professor Essig to give us an overview of what all is happening these days in the physics department, including maybe some thoughts about facilities or what their needs might be for the future in terms of equipment and directions that some of us maybe are going to help out on. So we'll turn that over to Professor Essig at the moment.
Thanks, Aris. In early March, Aris, out of the blue, contacted me via email and said, you might be interested to know that there's a physics alumni group being formed. And so at the next department meeting, I said, guess what? Aris wrote to me, we have 800 graduates of our department, and there's a alumni group being formed. So far, 100 people have shown interest in it. And I would say the reaction was just thrilled. Everybody couldn't believe it was happening, and we're very, very supportive. Our students are our life work, and just to be able to have some connection to you and to find out where you are and the interesting things that you're doing, like we heard today in the two talks, is just something we really value and find inspiring. So Aris asked me for the next meeting to give a presentation about what's currently going on in the physics department. So we'll do that. And then everybody else in the department is willing and wants to do whatever you want us to do. They'll attend maybe one by one and give presentations about their current research that they're doing in the department, or you just have to tell us what you would like us to do, and we're happy to do that.
I think certainly kind of a round robin of maybe 10-minute, 15-minute kind of presentations on each of our next sessions.
Yes.
Would be very, very useful, because I think all of us still have interest in, obviously, in Reed and what's going on. And also it helps us kind of get a sense of what's of interest currently in the physics educational community. So
Yes.
I would say, and by the way, I should mention that both the two talks today, I'm just really fascinated by them. As just a personal open opinion, this was absolutely great. And I would like to go down, every one of you, to talk about your career directions and what's happened. And I'm willing to do likewise at some point. But I'm finding this, for me, this interaction is just of great value. So I hope some of you will agree with that.
So I also did just quickly want to say that Reed's making it through the pandemic pretty well. There have been some protocols put in place by our administration that have been really successful. We're tested every week, but we have to meet our classes in real restricted ways. Probably in fall, half of our physics classes were in person and half online. And then this semester, it's been pretty much all in person, but in restricted ways. For instance, I'm teaching the advanced lab course, which some of you may remember as JLab. And so instead of doing it the normal way where students have a lot of choice of experiments, I gave a choice of just 15 experiments that can be done on their own, because we couldn't have lab partners. And so students chose 3 of those to do throughout the semester, and it's actually worked out pretty well. And then the other thing I would just want to note is that not just at Reed, but it's kind of in liberal arts colleges in general, there's been a migration of students to STEM majors. And so we have a lot of majors now. We're graduating 20 every year. And where in the past I was, of course, everybody has to do a senior thesis. In the past, I was doing 2 and maybe 3 theses every year. Now it's 4, and one year I had 5. So it's a really good problem to have, but it keeps us very busy.
What, in terms of sort of, are people thinking in terms of their careers? Is there a kind of a trend that you can detect in terms of the graduates, where they're thinking of going or what their plans are? Anything
Absolutely.
that we can help with?
Yes. So that, I think the migration to the STEM majors is in response to, national press in the last several years about the high cost of college. And so a lot of students just, it's pretty much $70,000 a year to come to Reed now. And so that's a big investment. And in order to pay off the loans that they take out, they have to have a job that will pay that back. And so that, I think that's what's going on in the STEM. And it's also happening in economics. Since we don't have a business program, economics is really overloaded with majors as well. And then the last 2 or 3 years, we now have a computer science major, and that's become very popular. And so yes, I think that, compared to maybe in the past, there's a more emphasis on, I want to get a job that when I graduate from Reed, and I want it to prepare me for that, which is maybe a little different way of thinking about a liberal arts education than in the past.
I saw you had your hand up, Chris.
Yeah, I had a question for John. Hi, thanks for joining us.
Sure.
A question about the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
So, when I was at Reed taking physics classes and just looking back on it, I think a fairly small fraction of the stuff I learned in those courses is actually directly relevant to what I do now. But I still think that having that traditional curriculum was great, and I wouldn't want to change it. And my question is whether there's any movement towards adding more applied things to the curriculum than the traditional physics program.
Well, so our curriculum has evolved quite a bit, but this possibly had been true in the past. We require 3 years of lab work, so hands-on work. which is kind of unusual for a small department because it's pretty labor intensive. And then probably half of our theses are experimental, which is maybe a more practical type of work. And then we, in our staffing, we only have 6 FTEs. So the way that we are able to staff our courses is we only devote 1 professor to the intro class. And then we're able to offer specialty courses for juniors and seniors. And those would include optics and solid state physics, which are maybe more practical type of subjects. But we also have general relativity still as a specialty class in elementary particles, and they're very popular. And we also have an astrophysicist on the faculty now, and she offers a specialty astrophysics course.
I remember someone earlier was curious how many students are in the physics department. Was that you, Bradford?
So we have 20 seniors on average graduating a year. And probably and so they have to declare their major as juniors. So that's the only time when we officially know how many majors we have. So that class is probably about as big as our senior class. So the 40 juniors plus seniors. And then there are the people in the pipeline from usually about half of our intro students, which is 80 or 90 person class, end up saying they're going to be a physics major, but then there's some attrition in the sophomore year.
How
we have a lot of students.
How many faculty do you have to support those students?
We have 6. Every year we have 6 people on staff.
Do any of them like rotate for visiting kind of spots, or all steady state?
Yes, we actually several years ago got staffed against sabbatical, and so we were the perfect size of 6 professors, so that if we had 7, then we never have to hire a sabbatical replacement, because each person goes on sabbatical every 7th year. But the very first year we did that, Mary James, who some of you may know, became our Dean of Institutional Diversity. And so she was on leave from our department. And so we do have to hire somebody to replace Mary every year. So we have visitors. Right now we have one elementary particle theorist who's finishing up his 5th year. And that's as long as you can stay in a visiting position by Reed's policies. And so next year, a new professor who's in optical physics is coming, and she's an experimentalist.
Oh, Bradford.
Back in the old days, we had a junior qualifying exam that terrified everybody. Do you still do that? Or just more generally speaking, is there some oversight in terms of who actually gets to be a senior? Or
that's actually still
just take anybody.
It's a college graduation requirement still to have a junior qual, and the physics still terrifies every student, unfortunately. And so we have modified it a little bit, where now it's supposed to cover your first 2 years. So we've divided it up for like fall semester physics 100, spring semester physics 100, same thing for the sophomore class. And then there's a 5th experimental section. So there are about 20 questions on it, and it's still a written exam, probably like what you took. And I would say most students pass it. It's a big issue for our debate, because if a student doesn't pass it, that's the sophomore, the spring semester of their junior year, and it's very difficult to find a major that they can switch to and graduate in 4 years. But occasionally, unfortunately, it does happen that somebody doesn't pass the qual. Most other departments don't give a written exam like this. They'll, like chemistry gives a research paper, and the student will come in after studying it, and professors will have an oral exam and just question them on that paper.
Hey, I think we can probably open it up to any general discussion on any topic. I think one of the questions that I would have would be helpful would be to identify some of you who might want to speak in subsequent sessions that we have. If you have some interesting thoughts, or if you have something you want to hear about. So again, as I said earlier, this is kind of we're still in a very much experimental mode here. We're trying to see what would be of interest to more of you, and to create the network, create the opportunities. So anything is open for further thoughts and discussion.